Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jessie De La Cruz, the Adult Programming Administrator at Denver Public Library, and I'm so glad you're all here and joining us. Tonight's conversation is part of our Author Talk series, and this is only our second Author Talk to be held in the new Parkview Room at the reopened Central Library. So it's a joy to see this space come to life through thoughtful dialogue and new ideas. We begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, among many others who have cared for this land for generations. We honor their elders, past, present, and future, and recognize that these lands remain sacred to Indigenous communities. Over the past few years, Denver Public Library has made remarkable progress thanks to your support and initiatives like Strong Library, Strong Denver, along with funding from Elevate Denver and the RISE bonds. We've expanded access, improved our spaces, and ensured fair compensation to our staff. And these changes are possible because of you. So thank you. After tonight's event, you'll receive a short survey by email, and it only takes a minute. But your response really helps me in bringing authors and programming to Denver Public Library that reflect the community we want to serve. So please take the time to complete that survey. So tonight we're thrilled to welcome Vauhini Vara, an acclaimed writer and journalist whose work explores memory, identity, and the digital age, a former Wall Street Journal tech reporter and contributing writer for The New Yorker. Her writing has been widely recognized for its depth, innovation, and emotional resonance. Her new book, Searches, is a deeply personal and genre-defying meditation on grief and technology, blending memoir, autofiction, speculative prose. It asks what it means to look for answers in a search bar, in our memories, and in each other. She'll be joined in conversation by Suma Nallapati, a nationally recognized tech leader with 30 years of experience driving innovation across healthcare, government, and high-tech industries. She currently serves the city and county of Denver, where she's helping address homelessness through the use of data and technology. A passionate advocate for equity in tech, she's worked with Girls Who Code, the Blind Institute of Technology, and Lady Coders to expand access and opportunity in that field. And with that, I welcome you both. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all.
Thank you, Jessie. Welcome, everyone. This is such a great gathering, and I'm so excited today with such an amazing writer. Your accolades through the roof, right? Like everything that you do. So we'll go right into the interview. But I'm so excited when I was given this opportunity. I'm like, I'm doing this. So thank you so much, Vauhini. So your book begins with a moment that feels very familiar to all of us. You get online for the very first time, and a whole new world opens up, right? So for the people in the room or someone walking down the street, how would you describe Searches, your new book?
So I was born in 1982, so I kind of came of age. I became like a preteen and a teenager as the internet was coming of age, as the internet was actually being born. And so I never had like an adolescence without the internet. But I was also part of a generation that remembered the time before that really well. I was sort of like right at that cusp. They call me an elder millennial. I'm sure there's some of us, many of us in the audience. And so I was interested, and I also for a long time have covered technology companies, including big technology companies, as a journalist. And it has always seemed to me that there's this kind of dichotomy, this seeming gap between the way in which, for me and for a lot of people I know, big technology companies' products have been these sort of like sites of self-expression and of communication among regular people, right? They have been sites of like self-empowerment. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, ultimately, the goal of these big technology companies, I would argue, is not necessarily to empower us and give us a space for self-expression. It's to make money, because that's their job, because they're companies and they are beholden to their investors, and their investors need a return on their investment. And so what I was interested in exploring in the book was like that uncomfortable fact, right? And I was wondering if there's a way to describe that evolution since the mid-90s, like through memoiristic writing, through traditional journalistic writing, while also using the technologies themselves and the writing I have done in the technologies to show something of that seeming dichotomy, which, as the book progresses, starts to turn out to look not like a dichotomy as much as like a kind of codependence or symbiosis, in which I argue we as users of these technologies have to acknowledge that if we're saying these big technology companies are exploiting us and the planet to an extent, which I would argue they are, we are part of the problem as users of these products. But if we acknowledge that we are part of the problem, but that these products offer something that we find useful, maybe that also acknowledges that we have the agency as individuals, as communities, as local and regional governments to figure out what's useful about these things and think about other potential models to provide those things for ourselves and somehow see if we can separate them from the exploitative practices that sometimes currently feel like they go hand in hand. When I said I use my language, the language I use with these technologies as part of the book, I'll just briefly explain that like every other chapter is made up of something like there's a chapter made up of my Google searches. It's like a essay in which I say something about myself, about the world I live in, by looking back at my archive of Google searches over 10 years, right, and using those to craft an essay. There's another one made up of my own Amazon reviews for actual products I bought on Amazon and reviewed on the internet. So there are all these chapters like that. And the goal with these chapters is to show something about what we find compelling about these products, why we use them, how they're exploiting us at the same time, and how those two things go hand in hand.
So it's a very interesting read, for sure.
Thank you.
You've explored like how maybe online you have maybe a different persona altogether based on your searches or how you come across on your online presence versus who you are really. How would you explain the gap, or maybe is it a different persona? Is it the same, or is it like something that you want to maybe not even reveal to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the conception of being a person, of selfhood, as being very bound up in performance no matter what, right? We're always in various contexts, like performing versions of ourselves. I'm performing a different version of myself when I'm, hanging out with my son, Covey, row 3. He asked for a shout out. He specifically wanted me to quote him. I'm still working that in, but I'm just, in case I pull a blank and don't quote him, this is the shout out at least. So when I'm hanging out with Covey versus if I'm in a professional context versus if I'm searching for something online that I feel deeply embarrassed about, right? And so part of the book, in the chapter, for example, in which I write about my Google searches, part of what I'm interested in is the way in which, as a writer, we writers talk about the way in which good writing is writing that is revelatory, that says something true, that is difficult to say, right? Sometimes because it's like unpopular with a kind of hegemonic or dominant culture, or sometimes because it's just plain embarrassing, right? And so I was interested to find in my own Google searches so much material that was so much more embarrassing, i.e. vulnerable, i.e. literary, one could argue, than what I've written in my own work, in my own published work, I should say.
So it's almost like a diary.
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah. And did you have like any revelations about, wow, I didn't know about that, about a particular thing about myself?
I wouldn't frame it that way as much as I would say that what interested me about the exercise was to was to notice that even though I'm a writer, even though like I make a living writing, I send emails, I send text messages like we all do, like so much of my life is spent writing. If I were to try to go back and like find the best possible archive of the years, 2005 to now, going back in my Google searches would be probably the best possible archive of that, right? Like I could keep track of where I've been, what I was interested in, what I was trying to buy, what I was concerned about. And so it's like this really, it's a useful archive for me. It's a moving archive. It's fascinating. And it's mine in a sense. I created all that text, right? It's mine in that sense. And yet, technically speaking, Google owns it. I can download it, right? I can download it. Yep. And so I guess I shouldn't say Google owns it, but I could say like Google controls the creation of that archive. And then once it's created it, the ownership is fluid in a sense because I can download it and keep it, but Google still has all that material, right? Yep. And Google's the one that's monetizing it. And so part of the exercise here was like, what does that then mean? Like, can I take that material, use it to create an essay, and then redefine it according to my own definition of value, which isn't Google's definition. Google wants to know about everything I've searched for so that it can target me with advertising, right? And make money.
Sell you more.
Sell me more. I'm interested in what I've searched for because it tells me something about myself, right? Like it's of personal interest to me. But also as a writer, it's potentially of artistic interest. And so I was like, can I create literature out of my Google searches? And then I'm like redefining it on my own terms. I'm also, once that essay was published in the New York Times and they paid me like, I don't know, $700 or something. So then interestingly, I am also reclaiming some of the monetary value in a funny way. It's in the book too, and I'm selling the book. And so but then at the same time, it would be very neat to be able to say like, so therefore now it's mine. I have succeeded in tricking Google, right? Like now I benefit and they don't. But of course, they still benefit, like while I'm also doing this thing, which for me is like kind of the point of the book itself. Like as much as we can do these things and I think they're very valuable to do, and yet they're still bound up in these systems.
That digital footprint and what the true cost is.
Yeah.
So you were a journalist for tech companies, right? And you have such a intense history with all of them, right? So do you think companies like Google or Meta should be held to the same standards as we expect from like governments? And me coming from government, right? So tax dollars are very, very sacred and we take that extremely seriously. But how about these companies? Are they being held to the same standards in your opinion and in your work as a journalist with these companies and in the tech industry itself?
This can be such a short answer if you want. My answer is no. I don't know. Sometimes it can be easy to say like, the reason they're not being held accountable is that Mark Zuckerberg's a big jerk and we're not, in reality, I think the reason government systems and individuals in roles like yours hold kind of the public good as the most important value is that is what government is designed to do. That's how we built government to function. That's like how the accountability systems are built. And of course that can be corrupted by money, but in terms of like how the infrastructure is built in the first place, it's meant to support that goal. Whereas companies are just not built with that goal in mind.
Checks
we can
and balances, all of those things.
Or not even, even beyond checks and balances, like literally the goal of a company is judged by, a company is owned by shareholders, and the goal of those shareholders is to make more money. And then there can be shareholders who have the social good in mind, certainly, but that's not, the system is not meant for that, right? So in the same way that money can corrupt government, the desire for social good can also influence companies. But I think like the top priority of each is just built to be different. And so therefore, like I think it's not surprising given that the accountability works differently.
Agreed. On the same lines, I have experience working both in public and private sectors, and I've seen innovation happen in different ways, and different drivers and different levers, right? So what do you think can be a good place for this kind of exchange of ideas where both the public and the private sector can work together for the common good, like all the things that you mentioned? But again, there's different reasons why companies do what they do and governments do what they do. But where do you think that confluence can happen, or is there even a possibility in your mind?
I don't know. That's a difficult question for me to answer, and I don't want to suggest that I have expertise in an area where I don't. I think that's a great question for you. I'm curious about how you would answer that question. In this book, I'm especially interested in the dominance of these big technology companies. The place where I do talk about the relationship between big technology companies and government is in a chapter that's focused in large part on Amazon as a kind of way of looking at how companies exert their influence. I grew up in Seattle, and in the mid-90s, when I was in middle school, Paul Allen, one of the co-founder along with Bill Gates of Microsoft, decided that he wanted to buy the Seahawks, and so he had this. He said, "Okay, I want to buy the Seahawks, but it's the Seahawks, right? Yeah, it's the Seahawks." He wanted to buy the Seahawks. I was like, was it another team? But no. But he didn't like the Kingdome, the stadium we had in Seattle, and so he had this clause where he was like, "I want to buy the Seahawks, but only if the city tears down the Kingdome and replaces it with something else." And he said, "I would pay for a little bit of that, but the city would have to pay for the rest of it, and then maybe I'd buy the Seahawks." And so that had to be put to a referendum, and he funded the entire campaign. He funded the effort to put the referendum on the ballot. Then he funded the entire yes campaign. And it was considered one of the very first times, like, the relationship between big technology money and local government influence was like so explicit. There were articles written about it where there were these academics saying, like, wait, is this even allowed? Is this possible? But it was, and it did happen, and that passed. And looking back now, some people say it's great that we kept the Seahawks and the new stadium is great. Some people say, well, we ended up using actually a lot of government funds to support Paul Allen's desire to buy the Seahawks and have them in town. And actually, Paul Allen benefited much more from that than regular people in Seattle did, right? Because you still have to pay money to go to a Seahawks game. And if you're putting taxpayer funds into that, there are other things you're not putting them into. Which is to say, I know I'm taking your question in a little bit of a different direction, but that was Paul Allen in Seattle. Jeff Bezos was starting Amazon in Seattle around the same time. Amazon is now usually one of the top 3 or 4 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to influence U.S. government policy, and one of the biggest lobbyists in Europe and elsewhere. And so for me, again, having grown up in Seattle, having grown up with the internet, I do think it's of course, the public and private sectors do work effectively together all the time. But I think what draws my attention especially is the way in which that money from the private sector can do a lot of harm in influencing policy at all levels.
Policy, and how about bias?
Yes, there is bias. So yeah, there are many ways to talk about this. I talk in the book a fair amount about AI because AI is sort of the most recent manifestation of big technology companies creating a product in which there's this dynamic that we talked about earlier, right? In which, like, this product is definitely beneficial to us in some ways. And it's also the case that in using the product in ways that we find beneficial, we are providing information to the big technology companies that is designed, as far as they're concerned, to benefit them more, right? Because the business model doesn't work if we're getting more benefit than they are. So there's this frame in the book in which I actually start the book with this conversation with ChatGPT where I say, hey, ChatGPT, I'm trying to write a book. If I share it with you, can you give me some advice and feedback on this book? And it says, I'll tell you what it says. It's very ChatGPT. It says, I say I'm nervous. And this is all I'm sort of playing a part, right? This is kind of a performance on my part. I say, I want to share this with you. I'm nervous. And it says, that's completely understandable. Sharing your writing can feel really personal, but I'm here to provide a supportive and constructive perspective. Take your time. And whenever you're ready, I'll be here to discuss it with you. And so I start sharing the book with it 2 chapters at a time. So I'll share 2 chapters, and then we go back in the conversation. I don't actually need help with the book. And I wanted to make that clear because some people who have read the book have thought that I actually got help from ChatGPT to write the book. I did not. I never intended to. What I was interested in doing, though, was leaning into like what a product like this promises us versus what it actually gets and what happens in the process, right? So with each of these products, as I play with them, I'm interested in like what they're promising us. With ChatGPT, I think what it's promising us, what the company says it's promising us, is that it's building something. This is a product that's really good at following instructions, like doing as it's told, giving us what we want. So I thought to myself, well, what I want is to see if I can get ChatGPT to like explicitly show the biases and shortcomings in the way it's built. And so I set out to try to do that, right? And it does it in really interesting ways. So for example, when I share some writing with it about big tech, which is fairly critical, and ask it for feedback, it comes back and says, this is good, but you could stand to be more positive about the tech industry. You might highlight some of the influential figures in the tech industry who have really done good, who have been visionary. And then I say, well, I was thinking about writing later about Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT. And it says, that's great. He's a great example of a visionary tech leader, right? And then later, after it reads what I wrote about Sam Altman, it sort of like, without my prompting, gives me this revised version of the Sam Altman material in which he comes across really well. All of which is to say that, like, in a sense, it is following my lead well, because I kind of was interested in showing that. It's showing that itself. At the same time, it's using language, it's using rhetoric, like what I just described, right, in that opening series, that I think is built to manipulate me even as I'm trying to manipulate it, right? So if the promise of this product is it's going to behave itself and do as it's told, there's an extent to which it's doing that, as I saw in these pages, but then the bigger purpose from a corporate standpoint, the goal of OpenAI is actually for me to be doing as the company wants, right? They want me to continue to use the product. They want me to trust the product. That's really, Sam Altman said in a speech, I think last week, that something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, and maybe you would remember it was something like, you know, we are building what we think of as AI agents that will go out and act in the world on our behalf. They'll make restaurant reservations. Maybe they'll even like be in our email and respond to our email, make our doctor's appointment, pay our bank bills, right? And if we want people to give us access to all that, we need people to trust the product, right? And so here, even as I feel I'm manipulating ChatGPT, I'm also being manipulated to trust it, right? Because the company's goal is for me to trust it so that I will provide more information that can then be used for its purposes, right? And so, again, like I'm trying to show that playing out in the pages of the book. I talked about bias, but I'm also talking more broadly about, because I think we talk about bias in kind of basic ways, but I think there are all these like insidious ways that sometimes we don't even recognize that it seeps in.
Agreed. It's truly an interesting world there with that. The next question, I've been waiting all week to ask you this, and it goes again from AI and tech and all of that to something very personal, grief.
Yeah.
And maybe you can read a chapter from that. How was it something like so personal, grief, and then being able to collaborate with a machine, and how was that interaction? And I'll give a personal story myself.
Yeah.
So I was one of a handful of students, female students in nuclear physics. That was my background. So just a handful, right? So it was always my dad that supported me and said, you can go do whatever you want, right? And then I lost him 2 years back, and the wind beneath my wings was just taken out. And that felt very like earth shattering and stuff. And I never even though I'm in technology, didn't even think about maybe using ChatGPT to help me process that grief. So very interested in that, and would love to for you to read a chapter, that particular chapter maybe.
Yeah. And I'm sorry
Thank you.
to hear about that.
And then my mom's here too, and she is right there. So
yeah, I mean, so I'll set this up a little bit. In 2021, so this was maybe 2020, so 2 years before ChatGPT came out, I was reading about this AI, this large language model, this AI model called GPT-3. And previously, there had been GPT-2 and then GPT that OpenAI was working on. And it wasn't publicly available yet, but they were giving limited access to it to like researchers and journalists. I had written a magazine profile of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, in 2017. So I still was in touch with him. I wrote to him and I said, can I try out this GPT-3 thing? I was interested journalistically in what a technology like this might mean societally. I was interested journalistically in like what it would mean for jobs like mine, right? If there was this technology was a precursor to ChatGPT, so it could produce language, right? It could generate text. And then I was also curious as a writer about what the promise was that a company or organization that was building a technology like this seemed to be making. At the time, what it seemed like was it was saying was something like, sometimes there are things that you don't know how to express on your own. This is a technology that will create words when you're at a loss for words, right? So I thought about the thing in my life that for me, like for you, it had been and continues to be something that's really difficult for me to communicate about in writing, certainly, but even like verbally, right? When talking to other people, which is the death of my sister of cancer when we were both in college. And so what I did was I went to this tech. The way it worked was it was like this white box, and you would type some text and then hit a button, and then it would continue the text for you. And so I went into that white box and I typed, when I was in my freshman year of high school and my sister was in her junior year, she was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is the kind of cancer she had. And then I hit the button, and it created this story for me about like, purportedly about me, right? And it talks about like how my sister and I had been playing lacrosse in high school, and we were both really into lacrosse, and then she couldn't play lacrosse, and then, you know, her friends came to visit her in the hospital. They were really supportive. That was great for her. And then the last line was, she's doing great now. And yeah, I know. I had that same reaction. I mean, and especially intensely, right? Because it was my own sister. I had gone to this technology that was supposed to like say the thing for me, but actually it said the opposite of the thing, you know? And so I thought, okay, well, that's not quite right. Maybe I should delete all of that it wrote, and I should write more of my own text, and maybe that's going to help it along to get closer. Interestingly, I did this sort of over and over 9 times, and as I went along, each time sort of like writing more text of my own, generating something, then deleting what it generated and adding more of my own text, it felt like what the AI model GPT-3 was generating was feeling closer and closer to something that sounded like the language of grief, and maybe even something like the language of my grief. There was this one line, there's one in number 7 where I'm talking about, number 7 of 9, where I'm talking about how when my sister was sick, we would go down to this beach near where we lived called Clark Beach. She began moving slowly and carefully. We'd go down to Clark Beach that spring that she was dying. She wanted to show us where to spread her ashes. And when we walked back up, I'd have to put a hand on the small of her back and push her. This is in the context of having previously written about like how energetic and bold my sister had been. And so later on, when ChatGPT is producing language, it says, it's talking about like the way in which it's impossible to kind of bring my sister back to life. And then it says, here then is something else. We were driving home from Clark Beach and we were stopped at a red light and she took my hand and held it. And then it goes, this is the hand she held, the hand I write with, the hand I am writing this with. She held it for a long time. I looked at our hands, hers so much paler than mine. She was still holding my hand when the light turned green. I didn't want her to let go. I wanted her to hold my hand for the rest of my life. So when I read those lines, like I, as the reader of that text, felt very moved, you know, like I felt moved, and I felt also that like on a kind of intellectual level, this text that was being generated was actually saying something about the subject of the essay itself, which was about the difficulty I was having with like reconciling the version of myself that exists in the world now without my sister with the version of myself that existed then, right? So by evoking my actual hand that exists then and existed now, it's like making that fact embodied and literal. And also making clear that like I am the same person, right? Like this is the same hand. And I found that like I might even use a word like profound to describe it. And that's really uncomfortable because it was written by an AI model. The additional thing though that I realized sort of in the process of going through this exercise, that after I read that, I still deleted all of it and continued writing on my own. And the reason ultimately I did that and could not do any other thing is that no matter what this AI model was producing, it actually wasn't my perspective. It wasn't what my experience was and what I wanted to say about it on such a literal level that my sister and I didn't even like go around doing sentimental things like holding each other's hands in the car on the way home from Clark Beach, right? Like we would tease each other, we would like maybe say sentimental things to each other, but she wouldn't like grab my hand and hold it, you know? And so even that line, which like on the face of it feels so profound, is like not really what I would express. And so what I came away from that experience feeling was that as much as technology companies have an interest in saying like, listen, if you're at a loss for words, here is a technology you can use to provide those words to you. It's not true. It's not possible. And I find that to be like ultimately the point of this essay. Interestingly, when a lot of people read the essay, they didn't necessarily read it that way. For me, though, that's the point. For me, that's very central to the essay.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing such a story, right? And how it impacted you, and how the machines are thinking about it. But it's that grief, the central theme.
Yeah. Wait, can I say one more thing about?
Yes.
You mentioned that word collaboration, which is a word that big technology companies will often use, right? In their statements on social media or in the press, or when they're going and talking, for example, to governments, or to oftentimes when they go to school districts, or to talk to people like writers or journalism organizations, they'll use this term collaboration. And just like 2 days ago, I looked up, I kept being asked about collaboration. I looked up that word. It's not a word that I tend to use to describe the way I'm interacting with it in this book. But I looked up the word, and I looked up collaborator, right? Collaborator is described as a person who collaborates. So then I looked up collaboration. Collaboration is defined as working jointly toward a shared goal, typically an intellectual one. So that word collaboration, like it contains humanness, it contains an assumption of intellectual engagement, like using your brain, right? And it suggests that two parties are working on a shared goal. And when you think about not AI as a technology, but the big technology companies that are developing these products, the products are not human. they don't have brains, and then most fundamentally, the goals of these companies are not the same as our goals. And so I think like that language sort of, again, it's similar to this language like, I'm here to help, right? Like, I'm here to be supportive of you. I think like it's rhetoric that sort of meant to foster in us this feeling of like, oh, these are here to help us.
Yep.
And I'm interested in like putting pressure on that, that thought.
That's very critical.
Yeah.
So at the City and County of Denver, we are evaluating AI capabilities to solve for public sector challenges. And the most important is, how leaders approach it, right? For me, that algorithmic transparency is very important. Explainability is important. Guardrails are important. The use of responsible AI, right, is because our resources are constrained, so we don't have the same kind of resources like in the private sector. So how can we use AI to supplement our resources? But it's a tricky thing, right? Like, again, data privacy, data, all of these need to be looked at in almost a sacred manner. And I don't think, again, these big tech companies have the same kind of agenda. So how do you ensure, as a leader, that you have that a human in the loop? To your point, nothing can replace the human intelligence. So I think it's important for leaders as they're evaluating these capabilities to keep that in mind. And you are looking at AI, emerging technologies, right? So how do you go about looking at this as the machines are shaping our emotional intelligence to a certain extent? What's your thoughts on how we approach that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, some research recently, actually by Microsoft and Carnegie Mellon. Maybe you're aware of this this research, Suma, where they looked at knowledge workers, so like people in white collar jobs who use generative AI, things like ChatGPT in their work, and they asked people who both used and didn't use these things to kind of like evaluate what was happening to their cognition, the way their brains were working or not. As they use these things. And it turned out that this study found that people found a kind of a significant decline or noticeable decline in their cognitive abilities and their ability to use their brains when they did use things like ChatGPT, right? And so, again, the promise that these companies are making is we're going to help you use your brain, right? Like, we're gonna assist you in doing the mental work that you need to do. And with these companies, they're always fulfilling the promise in some way, right? So going back to Google promised to provide us with information. I think it would be disingenuous to say, like, no, that Google's not really giving us information. I think Google is providing us with information, often with like useful information, often bringing it into communities where maybe that information hadn't previously been accessible. So it is doing that. And I think it's like not a complicated enough discussion if we pretend that it's not, right? It is doing that, but ultimately it's enriching itself, and the way the information is being provided is not according to a value system in which like the best information provided most widely is the goal. Similarly, Meta comes along and says, we're here to bring people together. On some level, it is bringing people together, right? Like, I can talk to family members in other countries on WhatsApp, which Meta owns. I can reconnect with old long-lost friends on Facebook or Instagram, which are both Meta products. At the same time, research suggests that people who use these products more tend to be more isolated. Teenagers who use these products more tend to have higher incidences of feelings of anxiety and depression, right? And ultimately, again, this is serving Meta's goals. So similarly with AI, the promise is we're here to help you become better knowledge workers, to help you use your brain better. And they're fulfilling it on one level. We can't deny that they are. And for any of us who's played around with these products or uses them a lot, we can't deny that. And then at the same time, ultimately, they're being enriched, and we are probably being impoverished in ways that we can't fully understand.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, you share some really tender moments about your early searches in the book. Things like, how do I become more beautiful? So looking back, now with your experience and expertise and all, what would you say to your younger self?
I knew you were going to ask this question, but I didn't think about it enough. You know, I think that younger self of mine knew what she was doing. You know, I mean, I think all of our younger selves. I think all of our younger selves knew what they were doing more than we understood at the time. I'm really interested, like, in this world in which, like, the definitions of knowledge and intelligence that big technology companies have. Oh, here's where I can cite a conversation with Covey. Covey and I were just talking today about intelligence. I referred to the term dummy, and I said, I don't think anyone's a dummy. And he said, really, you don't think anyone in the world is a dummy? And I said, no, I think we're all intelligent. And sometimes, like, we have kinds of intelligence that, you know, other people don't notice or that are minimized. And we were talking, he and I, about the way in which, like, sometimes you'll be, like, sitting in your classroom and another kid will say something that you find really insightful, but that's not a kid who normally gets all the attention for being the smart kid in the room. And you notice it, but you see that the teacher doesn't really notice it. See, I did it, kind of. You know, so I think, like, all of us in this room, all of us, like, as individuals, as communities, are collectively and individually a lot smarter than, like, any of those people running the big technology companies telling us that
Elon Musk, I'm just kidding.
Oh yeah, I will. We're on the record here. You know, telling us that they know what intelligence is, right? Sam Altman said in that same interview last week, he said he just had a baby, and he said, my child will never grow up to be as intelligent as artificial intelligence. And I was like, how could you say such a thing? I mean, I guess it's good for him that he believes strongly in his company. It would be, I guess I'm happy for him, but I think, like, the reason he can say something like that can't be, I mean, he's a parent. Obviously he knows already, looking at his baby, like, how brilliant that individual is. I don't believe that he doesn't. I think what he's doing is he's shifting the definition of intelligence, right? Yeah. So that it benefits companies like his. So I don't even remember what the question is, but we're all smarter than than machines.
I can talk about this topic and a lot more, but, you know, it's so fascinating, your thoughts on all of this, and your experience and expertise are truly remarkable. But I want to leave it to the audience questions. But I'll ask one last question, and which is, you ended the book with a question to the world. What is it like to be alive? Why did you want to end with that open chorus of voices?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about, so I've got this this sort of ChatGPT dialogue that spans most of the book except for the last 2 chapters. So I end the dialogue once it's sort of shown what I was interested in having it show, and that felt like it had run its course. The second to last chapter asks that question that I described at the beginning of our conversation, that goes something like, okay, so if it's true that these companies do offer us something useful, but it comes along with all this baggage, right? It ends up ultimately enriching them. Are there other ways that we can build technology that is going to serve the social good, what we find useful, what we find even fun and interesting, while being pulled away from those corporate goals? And what I'm thinking about there are ways that we can redefine ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Like, are there ways that local or regional governments might build and communally own technologies? Can we as individuals do that? Can technology workers and other people in the world decide that they're going to volunteer their time together for free to work on some projects together? Somebody's shaking her head in the second row there. how might we change? They're already, Wikipedia is one of the most visited websites in the world. That's run by a foundation, right? That's not run by a corporation. The same is true of all kinds of technologies we use, like the Firefox browser, for example. And so those models are out there. I'm interested in them. And I think thinking about that opens up for me this question of like, who it is that we are and what it is that we're looking for. So what I did was I created this Google form survey that said, that asked questions about who it was geared toward girls and women for reasons that are explained in the book or suggested in the book. But it asks, no, not girls, just women 18 plus. And it asks questions like, who were your ancestors? Who were the people who raised you? Where are you right now? What can you see from where you are? But also, like, what do you imagine for the future? If you could invent a technology that could bring about that future, what would it look like, right? What will happen when we get onto the other side? And the word technology there is defined however people want to define it, and people take it in all kinds of interesting directions. What I was trying to do there was many things, but one of the things was to provide a very clear counterpoint to the kind of language and rhetoric ChatGPT uses, right, in answering questions, because that last chapter is maybe my favorite chapter of the book. I wrote very little of it. I wrote only the questions and some of the answers, which I tucked in, right, with other people's answers. So I did the survey. It populated a Google Sheet for me. 120 something people filled it out, and then I used like a subset of the answers to kind of craft an essay made up of the questions and answers. And they're really like strange and profound. I feel like I want to like read one random one or two to you so you can see what I mean. Okay, so in this question where I ask, I'm asking people to imagine that we're together inventing a technology that allows us to combine our imaginations in order to create a better way of being human on Earth than we currently have. Describe some aspect of the technology, what it's made of, what it looks like, what it does, et cetera. So as I had hoped, some people were like, what you're describing sounds destructive. We should not invent this technology. Technology is definitely not going to save us. But then some of my favorites, okay, I'm going to read one that Covey is going to love. I feel like, where is it? Okay, Covey needs to know. Anybody, I think you know this. Do you know what flatulate means? It means fart. Okay, so that's important context. For anybody who doesn't know, flatulate means fart. So this one person goes, it has a part where you flatulate into a little steampunk nozzle and it turns it into fragrant oxygen. Wow. And then somebody else says, these are the last two, and I love them. Someone goes, 1,000 bicycles. And then somebody else goes, we return to storytelling and listening. We commit to this. So, like the way people are defining technology is really different here from how big technology companies define it, or how ChatGPT might if I asked ChatGPT that question. And I find that really beautiful.
I love that. Great insights. So Jessie, I don't know where she is, but I think we're going to open it up to the audience now. I can keep going, but I'm sure there's a lot of interest. Are we at the time where we open it up to the audience, Jessie? Yeah.
Question? Don't need to hold it super close. Should pick you up. I'm curious about your view on open source, because it seems to be, just from what I know about you from this talk, to maybe be the solution to your concerns, but I assume you have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think open technologies, such as open source technologies, open source software, and other open source technologies are a really potentially exciting part of thinking about like different forms of building and ownership of technologies. Big technology companies can still build something and say, we're open sourcing this, right? And allowing there to be some openness around that technology, but it might still be kind of fundamentally tied to that corporate model of making money. That said, I mean, I think more open is better than more closed, certainly. You know, and I also don't want to overstay. I think to the extent that I'm critiquing capitalism, essentially here, I'm smiling at my kid because like every day he's like, capitalism again. I'm most interested in the way in which the existing really big technology companies fit into the picture. And I think like there are all kinds of interesting ways like capital, as in resources, can be used. You know, we live in a world in which like money is the symbol we use to pay for resources to build things, right? And so like that's probably not going to stop being the case. And as long as that's the case, like there's going to be an extent to which like the people who have the money are going to be funding the projects. And so, right, like maybe private capital, private funding can certainly like potentially be part of that too.
Thank you for your talk. That was really very interesting. I'm remembering, I teach in this area, and so I'm remembering back when Google was new, yeah. And when Jaron Lanier, who was one of those people in technology, made an argument for how at that time we should be asking Google to make a system of micropayments, like where all of us are actually contributing our data, and so we're not getting anything back out of it. And now I think it's kind of exploded, as you're talking about, like there's so much exploitation going on, not just of our own data, but of all the minerals, the lithium mining going on, all kinds of things that are being extracted. So I'm just curious what you think about that. Like, has the train left? I mean, are we just going to continue to have greater and greater inequality, or are there some ways that we could think about how could we like put a price on some of these things and help to have language to talk about holding our technology companies in some kind of a relationship where our contributions as a society are recognized?
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question. The reason I think, here's what I'll say, like those companies are so powerful, they're increasingly powerful. I think the most obvious way in which the power of the rest of us can be employed to do something about, resist the power of these big technology companies is, number one, by acknowledging our agency, right? As you're pointing out, which for me is bound up in saying like, we're using these products because we find something good in them. We are making a choice to use them, right? We recognize it, and then if we recognize it, then we can, I think, together decide to do something different. I mean, I think like we live in sort of demoralizing times where there are periods where it can feel like that collective power is limited in its usefulness, right? But I think even like, and I succumb to that, but I think when we do, we ultimately are playing into the hands of the powerful who benefit, right? When we feel that way. I don't know, like you raise one potential way in which this could work. Sometimes I feel like, what you described I haven't read that Jaron Lanier book, but I'm familiar with his arguments. It reminds me a bit though of, some organizations representing authors are talking lately about the way in which big technology companies are trying to train their AI models on authors' work, right? And they're saying, okay, let's say authors should be able to individually decide how they want to engage with this, but maybe there should be a way for authors to willingly provide their work for training and be compensated in exchange, right? I'm not here like telling other authors how they should approach it. One concern I have with that is that it still ultimately is like it's like slotting us into the value system of the big technology companies, right? It's like you're still determining how value is determined you're still ultimately benefiting more than any of the rest of us. But like, could you just give us a couple $1,000s while you're at it, you know? And so I tend to be somewhat more interested in like the more radical re-envisionings, while also being lucky not to be like the CEO of the Authors Guild or someone in a position like Suma's, right, who actually has to do the work in which like there are practical concerns. I get to be a writer, and I think, you know, I was talking to, my cousin, my relative, so many of my relatives work in technology. And when I was just last week in San Francisco giving a reading, and we all went out to dinner, and I was talking about AI, and I was spouting this nonsense, like, you know, about our revolutionary future. It's not nonsense. I was spouting the truths about our revolutionary future. And then he said to me, like, what you're describing isn't practical. He works as a manager at a tech company, and he explained all the reasons that from his perspective they weren't practical. And I kind of said, like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. But then he said, but you know what? You're a writer, and the role of people like you, of artists, of one of the roles that artists and writers can have in our society is to imagine potential futures and make space for thinking about that, so that we don't end up in a future that's dominated by the rhetoric of people like Sam Altman and others like them, who have gotten in the habit of, like, on their blogs, writing these manifestos about what the future will be like, in which the future they're describing is ultimately a big tech-dominated future. And then they go to Congress and talk about it, and so then we hear our Congress people repeating that rhetoric, right, about our tech-dominated future, and then they go and talk to reporters about it, and then we see articles in the press about our tech-dominated future, and all of a sudden, that story feels like the one that's real, when in fact our future is unwritten. And I think some writer, including myself, has just as much of a right, I think, as Sam Altman to have some crazy idea about the future. And his ideas are, like, quite out there, too. Thank you.
There's a question here.
We had one down here, and then I'll head over to that side.
I think it's totally reasonable to be extremely skeptical about the motivations of tech companies. I'm curious if you feel like you have any examples, or if it ever happens, where the profit motives of big tech companies just so happens by design or chance to align with public good or just pro-social results in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think this would be an interesting question for Suma. I'll briefly address it. Well, let me see. I think Suma's a better person to answer that question than I am, because I think Suma has probably thought especially deeply about this. You know, when I think about this question, the examples that come to mind for me are outside of technology. They're really self-serving examples, because I think of industries like the journalism industry, in which, for all the problems in journalism, there's this idea, especially at the journalism organizations that are privately held or maybe even run by nonprofits. For example, ProPublica comes to mind, but again, then that's not a corporation anymore. So let's talk about, like, the publicly held ones. They are problematic. Like, I think journalism is as problematic as any industry, but there is something written into their charters saying, you know, the public good in the form of providing information and speaking truth to power is our highest ideal, right? Private educational institutions can be that way as well, right? And those can be companies. They're not nonprofits. Some are nonprofits, some aren't. But the private ones also hold education as their highest ideal. When I think of technology companies, I know of many that sort of have pro-social goals, and to the extent that, like, serving those goals is also going to serve their financial goals, I think those two can be aligned. But it doesn't feel for me, looking at the companies, the big ones that exist in the world, I don't necessarily feel that that's like a sort of like dominant, a typical way that it plays out. Suma, I would love to hear your additional thoughts on this, though.
There's so many thoughts swirling in my mind, right? Again, can you repeat the question? Because I know she answered it from, like, the journalistic and private education, but what is it that you're looking for in terms of the technical corporate responsibility?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you ever felt like the private profit incentive just so happened, or by design, to align with the public good?
I have a different take on that, right? So I was talking to the chairman of Dish Network, which is a local company here, and he said, I don't do these foundations and stuff, the corporate social responsibility, but what I do is I create jobs. I create economic stimulus in the local communities. And for me, he created more than 10,000 jobs here in Colorado. That's his biggest incentive, right? So even though some of the practices may not be aligned to what we want, from a moralistic compass or something, but I truly was amazed that he was thinking about creating jobs as his corporate social responsibility. So that was a different take. So maybe these companies are creating jobs, maybe they're creating jobs that we didn't even think about, and they're creating the future jobs, right? So maybe that's the overall goal that's helping us all have better lives. We held an AI summit last September here. Gartner was part of it too. We had Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt and others. And what Reid was talking about is how it's the recursions with AI happening so fast. It's actually helping us get to clinical trials faster and getting to medical outcomes faster. So that's one, right? It's being used in fire preventions and things like that too, because you don't have enough resources that are trained and all of that. So there's a lot that happens with that. And I'll give a personal example. I was just talking to Vauhini, is my daughter developed an AI algorithm when she was in school after the Parkland mass shootings. And she created an algorithm to predict mass shootings using data. So again, it could be used for good things. The things that stopped her was politics, both from the right and the left, right? So I think, again, there's good to the use of technology with the proper guardrails, the proper responsibilities, and with the human in the loop.
So I'm a big fan of your novel, The Immortal King Rao.
Thank you.
And it appeared with that novel, you might have been going down the path of a Margaret Atwood, if you will, of making political commentary in your novels. And that's not what you did. You went more of a memoir route, which is equally interesting. And I'm just wondering, those tend to be two different types of writers. Like, what do you think you're going to do next? Are you going to go down a novelist route or memoir route or back to journalism? I mean,
yeah.
I was working in Silicon Valley when you were working at the Wall Street Journal. So I've been somewhat following your career the whole time.
Yeah.
Big admirer and big fan. And I'm just curious on what you think you're going to do next.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to say is I think of this book as being in some ways like a prequel to the novel. So in my novel, I imagine more people here have not read it than have read it. So I'll just briefly say the novel imagines, it starts in like the 1950s, in the part of India that we both, Suma and I both have roots in. But it ends up in this sort of like imagined speculative future in which the world's government, single government, is dominated by big tech. So big technology corporations have taken over the government and they're using AI to make all of our social decisions about things like criminal justice and education and kind of everything. And there's some resistance to that, and that's part of the book. There's a resistance movement, that's part of the book as well. And what I was doing in that novel, I started the novel after 4 years of being a tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal in the mid-2000s. So that was when like Facebook was starting, YouTube was starting, Google went public. It was this time that was like, it was exciting, and then also one could look forward and say, oh, if things keep going this way, there's one potential future that, looks kind of dystopian, but we couldn't write about that in our journalism because you can't write responsible journalism saying like, here's what's going to happen in 40 years, because we don't know. And so I wrote this novel, like imagining what the world might look like if we go down a road in which big technology companies get more and more and more powerful. What I wanted to do in this book was situate it right now, like in the actual reality of right now. I know it's described somewhat as a memoir and it does have myself in it, but in some ways I'm using myself as a character to kind of like represent all of us, right? Because what I'm interested in this book is the way in which like we currently do have agency. We are not in that world I imagined in which the global government is literally run by one cabal of big technology corporations using AI to dictate our futures, right? Like, that's a world we can imagine. We're not there. If we want to not get there, if we think there's like a different potential future, it starts by acknowledging our agency. It starts by saying like, well, we do have a choice in the matter such that we can then decide to pursue a different future. And so in this book, I'm really fixated on the we have a choice in the matter part. And interestingly, some of the reviews I've read of the book I set up that idea of having choice in the matter by saying like, look, we use these companies, but because they provide something that we find useful, right? I think some people have read that as me saying like, there's bad, but there's also good. So it's all fine, right? That wasn't my goal. My goal was to say, to the extent that there's a problem, if we are using these products because we like something about it, we're part of that problem and we might go forward in a different way. So that's how the ideas in this book feel connected to me, to that one. Right now, I am working on a play that is adapted from Ghosts, one of the essays in here. Some of my colleagues on this play are in the audience here. And I am also working on a new novel that has to do with big tech and AI and our desire for a better world socially. Thank you.
Hi, I also really enjoyed Immortal King Rao, and I'm a bookseller in Denver, and I wanted to ask you an annoying question, which is, how do I best sell your book? And I admit that I didn't know what the book was about, but I came because it's you, and I loved Immortal King Rao. And when you said things like it touched on grief and other things, it really appealed to me. So I was wondering, from your point of view, how can I get the general public to be attracted to your book?
Isn't that your job? Jeez.
Yeah, I know. That's my job.
One thing, I'm just going to talk, I'm maybe going to do the opposite of answering your question by talking about something that's like tough for me, which is that I think like this book is in some ways about, like in some ways I'm a villain in the book, right? Because I'm like, I just can't stop using Amazon Prime, And by being a villain in the book, I'm inviting readers who also use Google and Amazon and Meta products and OpenAI products to also feel like villains. I want us to like all feel like villains together. Not like villains, because that suggests that we can't change. Like I want us to all feel a bit of guilt here. Audre Lorde writes often about guilt in a way that I found really interesting. She says she doesn't have a lot of use for guilt, except when it leads to action, right? Communal action, especially. And so I'm really interested in like using my own shame and guilt and desire, right? Like my own desire to use these things to like, I'm enacting it here in the hopes that like readers, when they read the book, will be brought into that. They'll feel it along with me. That will generate our like own large bubble of collective guilt that we can then act on. The reason that's really hard to sell, I think, is that, I mean, I feel like, like didn't Jimmy Carter lose the presidency against Ronald Reagan when he made a speech saying, actually, we all need to work together to make the world better and make a lot of sacrifices, and we're not living our best lives right now. And then Ronald Reagan came along and was like, just forget that. It's all good. I'm gonna create more wealth. We're gonna, create it out of thin air where it didn't exist before. You don't have to do anything. Things are gonna get better. I think that's an easier message to swallow. So I don't know, like it's probably really hard to sell a book by being like, here's a book that's gonna make you feel guilty and ashamed of your relationship with big tech companies' products. I mean, I've also heard from people who have read the book that it is like a page turner of a read, just because like there's something fun about like reading someone's Google reviews and Amazon, Google searches and Amazon reviews. Like you do feel like you're like peering into someone's brain, and you do feel like I think you're taking a kind of like a trip through the history of the internet that you kind of forgot about even as you've lived through it. So maybe you sell it that way and you leave out the guilt. I don't know.
So it's captivating and it's enriching in a way, but I think we all heard the word choice quite a few times over this evening.
Yeah.
I would just like to add on to it, or maybe enlarge it a bit more. When you say we are using this Google or Instagram or any of these, you are saying we are doing it because we wanted it to, or we are making a choice of using it. But then, don't you think the narrative is being played by the big tech companies overall in a very larger scope of manner than where it says you also have a choice to not give the data to someone else? Like when I am using Instagram by myself, I also have an option of saying that this is just for me. I am trying to do the search. I also have a button in there that says I'm not going to allow you to use this data somewhere else. And I don't think that portion of it is going outside or to the larger scope of audience who use it, especially to the people who are in the teenagers or who are just moving from adolescence to becoming the next adults of the society. And that's where I feel government or anyone who wants to be a part of greater good has to take that. You also can use it in a way that you're not thinking about.
Yeah. No, I'm glad I'm glad you're asking this question, because I keep looking over at you and like I see you have very expressive facial expressions. I keep thinking during this conversation, I've kept thinking, I wonder what she's thinking right now. So yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, and I write about it in the book too. As you point out, if you Google, search on DuckDuckGo for things like Google privacy settings or Meta privacy settings, Instagram privacy settings, all of these, OpenAI as well, you'll find pages within each of these products where you can adjust your own privacy settings. These companies do say this is another part of their argument, and I don't think they're fully, I think it's a legitimate point they're making, right? Like, you can adjust all the many settings. You do have a certain degree of control over how your information is used. Something like all of us in this room can go home today and do is go and look at all those privacy settings and adjust those settings so that they're set to where we want them to be. So I think that's a good like news you can use thing for us to do. It is true, and I don't know if this was also part of your point, that when I say we have choice, that is aligned with the argument companies are making. They're also saying, you have choice, like, why are you saying it's our fault? You're using these products because you want to. I do think I'm emphasizing the choice part because, again, in order to kind of open up our sense of agency and possibility to do other things, these companies have a lot of responsibility in our use of these products. There are all these lawsuits taking place currently that the FTC and the U.S. Department of Justice are bringing against these companies and similar bodies in other countries, right? The idea being you are so big and so powerful that you are using specific strategies, maybe deceptive strategies or manipulative strategies, to amass so much power that like any sense that people have choice is an illusion, because it all goes back to your products. That's all they can use. I think that's like a very legitimate argument. I think that's an argument that's like playing out in the courts between these companies and governments. And we can elect people to our government who maybe are aligned with that point of view. I think while that's happening, the part of the story, I think that's getting a lot of attention now. I think I was interested in like drawing our attention to another piece of the puzzle there too. Thank you for raising that.
I think that actually plays in very well to my question. On a more holistic aspect, I can speak for myself, and I imagine many others, that there is no way I'm extricating myself from the use of technology every day. What practices, either researching this book or that you've thought of since then, can we use on a day-to-day basis to make us more mindful, thoughtful users of technology?
I think it starts with just practicing asking ourselves when we use these technologies, like what the relationship is between what these companies are promising, what their business model actually, like how they're actually making money, right? And how that relates to our own needs. Because I think there are ways that we were just talking about, actually, that we can, in our day-to-day use of these products, we can do certain things to get some of the benefit that we're looking for from these products while minimizing the exploitation, at least of us, right? At least of our personal information. So that's one. We might think about using products that are built under different kinds of ownership structures. So, we might consider using something, and I don't even want to name names because it's all kind of bound up in bigger systems. So, for example, I could say we might use the Firefox browser instead of other browsers. However, the foundation, Mozilla, behind the Firefox browser is largely corporate funded, right? DuckDuckGo is a search engine that just operates differently from a Google. It is not collecting people's information in the same way. People sometimes find that means the search results aren't as relevant to them as Google search results are, right? So I think like an awareness of this and making decisions like that are just fully informed by how these companies operate is a good first step. I think because AI is so new, it's not as entrenched in our daily lives as some of those earlier technologies. I think with the earlier ones, we started using them at a time where like this wasn't as much a part of the conversation, and now they're so much a part of our culture. I think we're still in a moment where people can very easily decide for themselves, I am not going to use large language models, right? I'm not going to use products like ChatGPT, or I'm not going to generate images with image generation models, right? Maybe that'll change, but maybe it won't. And I think part of the way in which we will determine whether it'll matter or whether it won't is by deciding for ourselves, sort of as a culture, like what kind of future we want, And I know that's not a satisfying answer. I should also say the book is called Searches because I was interested in the questions, and again, just to reference Audre Lorde again, in the spirit of thinkers like Audre Lorde, and sort of counter to the rhetoric of leaders of big technology companies who will often say, here is the specific future that is going to come about, and here is exactly how we're going to get there. I wanted to resist that by saying, I have no idea what all the potential futures are, what all the steps are that we might take in order to get there. I would not want to be the person to lay out that path, because that almost feels like I'm sort of falling into the same trap as the Sam Altmans of the world. All I want to do here is ask the questions, conduct the searches, right? Like, leave us together in this space of like active questioning so that we can kind of decide together where we want to go from here.
Okay, I think we're going to do 2 more questions. And then Vauhini, did you want to do book signing?
Yes, I'm happy to sign books.
And then there'll be book signing out there.
I was just curious how often or not you clear your history cache or cookies if you were pulling stuff from, say, 2005, and if you've seen how that influences your ad traffic at all. And I also just wanted to touch on like digital erasure. And, I think all of us have, lost people close to us, some who are very tech friendly and some who aren't, right? So you might have a voicemail from a parent or someone who's around your age, like years of social media history. Just kind of what your thoughts are on that, and if in your career you've ever reached out to like LexisNexis to just see like what they have on you, maybe related to your searches.
Oh, interesting. What does LexisNexis track about individuals? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Oh, I didn't realize. I use LexisNexis as a journalist because they have a really good media archive. Okay, I'll do that though. No, I have not done that. Sorry, what was the first part again? I clear my cache as often as the next guy, I think. I don't have like a regular practice. I don't have like a kind of like data hygiene practice where I say, every X often I go and clear this or delete my Google search archive or, which is part of what I think makes me like a good villain for the book, right? Because I didn't want the book to be like somebody who's doing it all right, telling everybody else how to be more like them. I mean, I'm interested in reading that book, but I just like, first of all, I can't credibly be that person because I'm not that person. But also I think hopefully there's something accessible about the fact that I'm here saying like, yeah, I'm not doing this the right way. I would like to. How can we move toward that,
Considering what you were saying about power of the user or maybe lack thereof, and then the definition of intelligence, I was curious to hear your reflections on the US centrism of ChatGPT and like the experience of like grief, for example, as from a Western concept. Did you come up with that, or did that come up as you were writing?
Yeah, absolutely, in lots of different ways. But I'll give you one example that I feel like kind of encapsulates it. So I write in this book about my family, and there's material in here about my dad, about my mom. And so with that material, I sent it to each of my parents. I said, I want you to know what's in the book, and you can tell me if you don't want it in the book, or if there's something I got wrong, or if you want me to include your perspective. I sent my dad all the stuff, and he first wrote back and was like, yeah, it's all fine. And then he wrote me a follow-up email that was longer, and he sent me, my dad has a habit of editing his emails with ChatGPT. So he sent me the ChatGPT version, and at the top he'll say ChatGPT version in capital letters. And in that, let me see if I can find it actually. I keep paraphrasing it, but I've got the book in my hands. Let me see if I can quickly find it because it's very relevant. In that email, he said, here it is, okay. He said, okay. Okay, so in this email, he ends up objecting to my superficial, this is how I describe it, my superficial treatment of his experience. He goes, so he's like, actually, I have more to say. And he sends me this long email, and one line in the email goes, one needs to spend time with people and work with them to write about their struggles. Only then can you produce great work. It's a great, very, very my dad, but there's something a little off about it. So I went and looked. He also sent me the original email. So I went and looked and compared them. And the original email was almost exactly the same. It started, one needs to spend time with people and work with them to write about their struggles. And then he goes, then only you can produce great work. So the then and the only are in a different order. ChatGPT had inverted that to only then, which is a kind of typical construction in American English, right? Only then can you blah, blah, blah. A much more typical and correct structure in Indian English is then only. Maybe I shouldn't say Indian English. I would say Indian English in the part of India that my dad is from, but I think more broadly too. So he was using English perfectly correctly in a way that was bound up in his own identity and his own position in the world, and in a way that allowed him to express the thing that he wanted to express, like the way he was expressing it. Here, ChatGPT, I would argue, is corrupting actually what he's saying by taking his message and turning it into American English, right? It's a small example, but I think it's an important one because there are only right now a handful of companies like these that people turn to sometimes help them write, and ChatGPT I think is the most common one. And so we can imagine a future where people from all over the world with all of their different Englishes, English and all languages being something that we communally own, right? Like there's no single power that gets to decide how we use language. We get to use it however we want. So we have all our different Englishes. We all start putting our Englishes into ChatGPT and saying like, hey, can you clean this up for me? And then ChatGPT turns that all into American English, right? We end up with like this sort of single approach to self-expression that doesn't reflect anything about all the differences in the correct differences in the ways in which we correctly express ourselves, right? And ends up creating the impression, first of all, ends up creating all this communication that sounds the same, but also creating the impression that like the right way to communicate is the way that ChatGPT tells us to communicate, which among other things creates this dependence on ChatGPT. It's like we create a future in which like if there's only one right way to communicate and it's the ChatGPT way, like we're all turning to a product owned by a big technology company in order to tell us how to talk. And speech, communication is something that is like so fundamentally our own, something that like people can try to slot into sort of systems of domination and power, and they have obviously for all time. But like that's something we have too. We always will, and so I worry about big technology companies trying to take that over too.
That was super fascinating. I can just hear you talk for like hours and still like try to learn something, even though I'm a technologist. So that was super, super, super cool. Thank you again so much for everyone being here. So we'll have the book signing there, and it was incredible talking to you.
Thank you so much, Suma.
To the
It was
great
for me
audience
as well.
too. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.